So, now that you have your plugin and you know how to use event handlers, you might want to consider branching out to other add-ons to Exiled, such as custom roles and custom items. In this video, we're going to make custom items, mess about with coroutines. I guess I'll also have an example of a ternary operator. But just as a general guide, what you're going to want to do is first have your plugin all set up, plugin config, whatever you want. I like to create a directory for all my custom items. Another thing you're going to need to do is in here, just add after here. Going to add a custom item dot register items, and custom item dot unregister items down here. If you are going to if you're going to try and use this as a base for custom roles, you're going to need to do custom role dot. It's complicated as you need to, I believe, create an instance of a custom role and then register it. You can't just do this. It doesn't work for all custom roles. If you were to do this for roles, though. Anyways, now that all your custom items will register when your plugin starts, you're going to need to create a new file within your custom items directory. Name it whatever you want. For this tutorial, we're going to make a C4. I'll show you the implementation as we go. And whenever you do custom item stuff, it needs to inherit from custom item. However, this is going to be a custom grenade, so I'm going to reference custom grenades. Another thing is up here, you're going to add custom item, an item type, and then find the item you want. And this is going to reference this up here, exiled.api.features.attributes. And this essentially specifies what kind of item this custom item is. All of these things here are just stuff we have to implement. So, for these, there's going to be a lot of overrides, which is just, well, required things for your custom item. So, this is what the generic attribute of a custom item looks like. Of course, these will change, like whether or not it's a string, what the variable is called. In this case, we're going to call this custom item a C4. Just click. We're going to also, here, if you just, for writer specifically, if you don't type override in fully, you can see everything in here. Some of these things are methods, but most of these things here are properties which we're going to override. So you can just double click on description and it'll come up with that. And I've already made this custom item in another file because it's kind of complicated to do this stuff. It takes debugging. Didn't want to make sure I messed it up, so I literally have a copy of it in another monitor. So I'm just going to copy what the description there is word for word. Now I'm sure that you're wondering, what's this? Why is it purple? And what's this? If you don't know what this stuff is, well, keep listening. And if you do, feel free to skip. This indicates that it's going to create a new line, as in, here, if I were to go down here, move my screen, let's say, I actually need to go back up here. Say I have a string like this. So, what a new line is it's kind of hard to represent, but be doing like this. This is considered line 1, line 2. This is very inaccurate, but I'm just trying to show what this will look like in game. The /n, well, it's a backslash, which is above the enter key. It's not like the slash in a command. The \n means it's creating a new line, so it'll have this line, then this line below it, and then this one below it. This is part of the description, so this will show up whenever you select it or hold it. I've set my configs for my server to only display the selected message, not the pickup message. And this here is a text mesh pro tag. If you want to figure out what they all are, just look them up. And we're using a specific version of Unity. I believe it's like 2021 or something. Just go open up Unity Hub and pull it up. Yeah, Unity 2021.3.17f1. So, you can just look up what the text mesh pro tags are for this. There are several other text mesh pro tags you can use. Some indicate what the size of the text looks like in this case. Some can make it bold, italic, underlined. You can even move it a bit, but you don't typically need to do that. But in this case, it just makes this text small, about like, I don't know, a third of the size of this text, because this is just something I want to mention. Next attribute we're going to overwrite is the ID. It's a uint, meaning it's an unsigned integer, which means it goes from like 0 to like 4 billion or something. Anyways, in my case, I'm just going to make it 1, because I'll have no other custom items on my server when I test this plugin. And the ID needs to be unique no matter like what other plugins you have. So if you're going to make a plugin somebody else is going to use, a suggestion I would make is that in your config file, you add something like an uint you can change in the config, which changes this. So like this, how we did this, you would just do config.id, put that in here, and then that way whenever the custom item is registered, it picks the ID in the config, so that plugin developers, oh no, not plugin developers, server users can use your plugin and change the ID, so that way your plugin doesn't conflict with anything else. Some other required attributes are weight. Now, just set to default. I don't really know what this does, to be honest. I assume it picks the normal value of weight, but it doesn't work for fuse time, I believe. It's complicated. Explode on collision does what it says on the tin. I don't want my custom item to do that. I want it to work like a normal grenade if you throw it using left click, not T. Which is what this text here is trying to indicate for when you select it, so that way you know how to use it. Default fuse time of a grenade is 3.5 seconds, I believe. Lastly, you need to create spawn properties. If you don't plan on having an item spawn naturally, you can leave it like this. However, as an example, I've come up with some stuff. Surprised it's not initial. Alright. So, when you copy other people's code, you might run into something like this every now and then. Fix that, you just right click here, properties. And I don't know, I think I'm just going to go with 12.0. I don't believe you can go too high, as certain versions of C# might not be in-game, but I don't know. Anyways, so this spawn properties thing, what this means is it's going to spawn one of these items. That's what limit means. Dynamic spawn points is a list of dynamic spawn points, and I'll show you what those essentially are. Just gotta create a new one. You have, of course, some built-in properties. What this effectively is, once my ID stops displaying stuff, is it's new. We're creating a new instance, well, just a new spawn properties, which is a class. And this class has properties. One of those is a limit. How many? That's max. It's 1. It has a list of dynamic spawn points, which is what these are. In this case, they have chance as well as location. And location can be a lot of different stuff that's predetermined. I believe you can even specify via a vector where to spawn. I believe that's more of a static spawn point. I don't know. Feel free to research it. You can always look at the docs I showed in the last video. Shows everything you'll need to do. Now that our custom item is done, we need to actually create its behavior. In order to do that, first thing we're going to create is we're going to override. And here you can see everything you can override, although some of these have become obsolete. I don't know why, but just work with it. I'm going to override subscribe events, as well as unsubscribe events. And I'm going to also add up here I'm going to add same message as here, I believe, yeah. So that way I can reference the specific type of player with a different name. And then in here we can subscribe to whatever events we want. Essentially we can subscribe to events just like here, but we can do it inside of subscribe events. That way all of our code is organized. My suggestion is you do this, although in theory you could subscribe to every event within the on-enabled stuff that happens in your code. Although it is less efficient, because if you unregister an item, then it would also unregister the events here. So it's just generally better to do stuff like this. Anyways, we're going to subscribe to a lot of events, like dropped item. For now, I'm just going to leave the errors, as I just want to do this. Another thing we're going to add is we're going to use the event handler for map, which I've now made emap. Here's the 3 events we're going to subscribe to. Right now we don't have any methods to actually subscribe them to, so we're going to wait until those methods are created, which we can work on now. Now, this name doesn't really matter. All that matters is when you subscribe to an event, you reference it. Ta-da! Now the statement's happy. This thing says it can be made static. I don't really care because I might reference something non-static in the method. What does matter is you have these event args. You can name them whatever you want. In my case, they're named Eevee. And the first thing you want to do whenever you normally have any sort of event within a custom item or a custom role and you're using something like this is you want to make sure that whatever item or pickup or object it's an instance of your custom item. We can implement this by doing if and then not, which is what the exclamation mark means. Check, which is a method inside each custom item. You can see the description here. Checks an item to see if it's a custom item. It also exists for pickup, player, and projectile. So projectile would work for custom grenades, player would work for a custom role, etc. I believe in the custom item case, checking a player checks their current item or their inventory. Anyways, it's a method, so we need to feed it ev.pickup, which is the pickup in this event. And this event contains all information after a player drops an item. It's important. We add return after that. And what this means is if not item is not a custom item. So it's kind of like an if not sort of deal. Because check returns true if the custom item or if the item is a custom item. And we want this to be true whenever we check an item and it's not a custom item, because this event fires for any item. Whenever this event runs, if this is subscribed, this will run. So we got to make sure we check the pickup, and if it's not a custom item, we check it, it'll give false, and then we invert it with this not operator, and then it becomes true. And if true, which means this will fire, it returns, meaning it simply doesn't do any more within the function. It just stops. So that way, now after this, we know whenever we reference ev.pickup, it's a pickup of the C4. And we'll use this later. Actually, no, we'll use this now. What we're going to do is, in this case, I'm going to use the switch statement. I'm going to switch this attribute was thrown. And the switch statement means it's going to take something. It's going to take an object, and you can check it versus any other case. So say we switch a string. I'll just dumb it down for now. We can switch a string, and then we can do case, where it's like, we can check if it's 111, or we can run code. Lots of things you can do. But if you have something that changes, like we could actually switch ev.player and dot like nickname. So say you want to check the person who threw this. We can have case and say this is player 1 or something. If their name was player 1, this any code inside this indent would run. And then the break function means it gets out of the switch statement. But in our case, we're switching whether or not the pickup was thrown, which means it's a difference between right-clicking it out of your inventory or throwing it. If it was thrown, what we're going to do is we're going to need to run what's called a coroutine, which is code that runs repeatedly over time, that we want it to check to see if the grenade collides with something. Then we want to stop the grenade from moving, and we want to start looking for nearby players who are on an opposing team. That way the grenade can then explode. So it's basically like a proximity mine. Of course, what we need to do is run a coroutine. First thing you want to do when you're doing coroutines is make sure, give me a second. Alright, once you find your plugin resources or reference, you can get them from the Discord. First thing you need to get is a simply C# first pass, as this has MEC, which stands for more efficient coroutines. We need this in our plugin. And what we're going to do is, within the same class of C4, but outside of this method, I'm going to create a coroutine, which for now I'll make it public. Or it's going to be a public enumerator of float. I'm going to call this stick. Now this just wants a reference, which is why it's red. Don't really ask why this works. This is what you add before the method, and then this is the name. Then you have any arguments you want in here. In this case, we're going to have a pickup. We can call this item, and then a faction. Now these both want references, so just import them. A faction is, well, I'll show you if I pull up the thing. It's all the different teams that can fight each other. Flamingos, Foundation Enemy, which is like CI, D-Class, Foundation Staff, Facility Guards, Scientist, NTF, SCPs, or Tutorials, which should be unclassified. And that's about it. Is to just make sure that we don't have the grenade trigger when it, like, next to a Scientist, and if an NTF operative threw it. So it's important to use faction, not team, which is something you can pull up. Now we have this. First thing you're going to do is do while true, or while you have a condition of whether or not you want this coroutine to run. Inside here, you're going to add yield return timing that either wait for 1 frame or wait for seconds. One of these two. In this case, I want this to work quickly, so I'm going to make it wait for 1 frame. Now that we have our coroutine, we're going to want to run it within here. how you do that is you do timing.run coroutine, and then your coroutine. Then you gotta give it its arguments. e.pickup, then ev.player.role.team.getFaction. So in event args, it gets the player, it gets the player's role, it gets their team, and it gets their faction. Make sure to add a semicolon at the end. So now this coroutine will start running whenever we drop an item and it was thrown, meaning you threw it with like the T key. We're gonna add the case of false in a bit, but for now we're just gonna be very linear of how you develop something like this. Now, in this coroutine, which we can make private because we're referencing it within the same file, what we now need to do is we need to check that the grenade collided with anything. The reason we're using a coroutine and not like attempting to find an event with the projectile object is because those kinds of events are weird. I'll see if I can find it. This is called a cast, by the way. It lets you go from like a different class of object to another class if it's castable. In this case it is. So now we can read all the the time grenade projectile stuff. In here, you go to here, and I believe it was here. Yeah, here's the on collided event. The issue is this does not have enough information. For instance, it doesn't have which thing collided, just simply has a collision, which is a unity thing. If it isn't an Exiled event, I wouldn't mess with it. So we're not using that. Instead, what we're going to do is use physics. I know, it's going to be sad. And what we're going to do is actually... Give me a second. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard, and we're going to use the fact that in an ideal setting, if you were to throw an object like this, let's say it's a ball, I'm going to see it. If you throw a ball at time 0, it's going to have an x velocity like this and like a y velocity like this. And then at the peak, it's going to have a different y velocity, but the x velocity is going to be the same. So the x velocity, these are equal, but this thing is, let's say it's right before the peak, so it's going to have a little bit of y velocity. But the y velocity can change. It can always decrease, can't increase. Well, it can't go more positive, but it can go more negative. But the x velocity is always equal in an ideal scenario. However, SL is not very ideal. Well, I assume it isn't. But that doesn't matter because we can just do ev.pickup and then reference the rigid body, which is, it is a unity thing, but it's pretty simple to use. Rigid body is essentially the physics object of it all. It appears I have made a mistake. No, I get the feeling I'm missing a reference. Probably a physics module. So I get the physics module. Ta-da! Free stuff to reference. So make sure you always check your references if you aren't finding something. Now we can go into here and look, is drag. Set it to 0, all of a sudden, this scenario happens now. The X thing is always the same because there's no drag that could ever slow this down. So now that we set this to 0, we know that our thrown projectile is not going to slow down in the x direction, and it can do whatever it wants in the y direction. And we're going to use this, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at each case of the grenade colliding with something in the XZ plane. It's going to be maybe a little bit hard to visualize, so I'll draw this. This is the X, Y, and Z plane. However, because Unity's weird, the more comfortable, it's going to be more comfortable to think about it like this. So Y is your up and down in game, and X and Z are your 2 dimensions, like forwards, left, backwards, and right. So this is like looking straight downwards onto the ground, and then we're going to have our grenade here, and then in the case where, let's say, it bounces with something, we're going to look at each of these cases. Say it bounces off of something in the positive z direction, its z velocity, which was once positive, goes down. So we're going to make a table. No, this might be annoying, but I just want to visualize what's happening mathematically, because we're using our brain here to make plugins. So this is T0, T1, and T2. We'll say the ball being here is T0. Actually, I guess we only need 2 T values then. So the ball being here is T0, and then the ball coming off of the wall is going to be T1. Now you look here, its z velocity here is going to be positive, and here it's going to be negative. And the same applies for here. For here, it's going to be the inverse, and also here it's going to be the inverse. So we can look at the different cases of how it bounces. You can also think of it as just the velocity changes in a certain way. It's impossible. I mean, if the x and z velocity ever change versus what it is, could be thought of as a collision. So then we just need to make sure that the previous velocity is not equal to the current velocity, because we just need to notice any change. However, this sort of thing does not apply to the y, because the y is always being dragged down by gravity. But we can know that if it were, this is going to be an XY graph now, which is, say you throw a grenade off a bridge, goes down and bounces. We can try and detect this inside our code where the velocity goes from, well, the velocity can never become more positive. That's the main thing to note. So then in here, now what we do is we define some constants. And then inside our coroutine, we're going to define this stuff. Make sure you use the Unity engine vector3, not system.numerics or whatever. Gonna find this, and now we're gonna have an if statement. Make sure to check for collision, and then that's what we want to happen, and then we're going to break. And afterwards, we're just gonna do previous x is equal to velocity dot x, etc. Keep this up. We can initialize these with initialize it like this. Now in here, what we do is if previous x is not equal to velocity.x, or I'm going to use mathf.approximately because it's better. What this says is basically if the previous x and velocity are the same, then this becomes false, so it doesn't do this, but this is an OR operator, meaning either of these have to be true. However, if these velocities aren't the same, as in it collided with something, this becomes false, this becomes true. It's an OR operator, this becomes true. Then we have code to lock our C4 into place. But I also want to add to check the case for previous y, it'll look like this. What this says is if the previous y is less than 0 and the previous, or in the current, y is greater than 0, meaning it bounced off something while going downwards, then it will run this code. Now in here, we need to lock the C4 into place. How do you do this? item.rigidBody.velocity is equal to vector3.0. So this entire thing freezes. item.rigidBody.useGravity is equal to false. And then this will do. It'll freeze the item to the client. Another thing you can do is, depending on whether or not you want other explosions to interact with it, you can use detect collisions. In this case, it'll be false, so this entire thing now freezes as soon as it detects, hey, I collided with something. Freezes. Now we need to check for enemy players. So we can do that with another coroutine. I'll call this detect. Haven't made it yet though. Then in here, create another private IEnumerator afloat, detect, and then here, this will run with another pickup and another function. And here I can just feed it the same parameters as the previous one. Now here, while true. Then let's say I want to make this slightly slower than the throw one, because the throw will only last for a couple seconds. This thing might be here for a while. So say I want this to wait a little bit longer. If I make this 0.1 and then F to indicate it's a float, then it'll wait an estimate of 0.1 seconds. This function simply scales it with the tick rate, I believe. So now it'll try and wait 0.1 seconds before checking. Now we're going to use something called a LINQ, or language integrated query, something like that. Very important in C#, pretty quick apparently. That looks like is we're going to make an if statement, because now we have this code running every 0.1 seconds. Now I need to check if there's an enemy nearby, meaning a player whose faction is not the provided one. So now we do player dot, oh, wrong player. Try to import the wrong player. This is why I named my player that for events ePlayer, because I can go here, exiled.api.features.player. This has what I'm looking for. I do player.list.any, which is a LINQ operation, and this will try to see if there's any elements of this list that has a property that I'm looking for. And you're going to do this, which is essentially going to provide what the name of reference variable is inside. I'll just write it out and explain it once I'm done. So, this is a bit long, but I'll try to explain it. So any function will look through every player in the list, and it'll look for an instance where the condition in this bit is true, but this is any variable, let's say in the list, that you can look at. That way you can iterate through each list. It's like doing for each player in player.list, and then if player dot blah blah blah, and then another if statement and another if statement. This is just combining them. So in here we use vector3.distance, which is a method provided by Unity, which compares distances. We find the distance between the player and their position. Let's say if it's less than a range, then okay, a player is close enough. Next thing we check is if their faction is not equal to the faction specified before. So that way we know it's an enemy. And then we check that the player is not an NPC, in case you have any sort of NPCs inside your plugin, or not to conflict with other plugins. That way we don't accidentally trigger this just because somebody else wanted to have an NPC for something. I mean, you may want this, may not. You can always remove it. You could even make it a config option. Anyways, now that we got this, we got our check. We just say, if this is true, if there's any player that's nearby that's close enough and on the right team to trigger this explosion, then we can run our code in here. But one thing I want to do first is I want to make sure I know who's going to be the person responsible for the explosion. If I make it the server.host, which is something you can do, like literally just server.host, which is essentially just dying to null. If that happens, it would hurt anyone nearby, including teammates of the faction. So there's some checks we need to do. And another thing that I wanted to add is if the player who threw the C4 is still on the right team, or leaves or comes back, then if the grenade triggers, they get the credit, so they knew who threw the C4. How we're going to implement this? So we're going to do. Going to define a player owner who's going to be the owner of the explosion. That's about a trigger. And we're going to use a ternary operator, which is a bit complicated, but once again, you just gotta see how it works, and it shouldn't be that bad. We're gonna check the pickup's previous owner. We're gonna check their role, their team, and get the faction, and then go to faction. Then we do this bit here is something you can understand. We check the pickup's previous owner, we get their faction, see if it's equal to the faction. So this is like saying if the person who threw the C4 is still on the same team. If they are, this code that comes after the question mark will run. If it's false, then it'll be after the colon. It's not that the code will run, its owner will be defined as whatever's in here. So I can just put in here item.previous owner. And then in here, I'm going to do another LINQ thing. It's going to be player.list, and then I'm going to use first or default, meaning it's going to go search for anyone who satisfies the condition within the parentheses. And if it can't find anyone, it's going to go to a default value, which in this case is null, which will default to the server host on the explosion method we'll use later. So if it can't find somebody on the wrong or on the right team, it'll just use an explosion. However, because we're checking the faction, we know that if this was false, then there's no chance of friendly fire because there's nobody to friendly fire. Then we do the same notation here. And my IDE finished it for me, so we just check that they're on the right faction. It'll just look for anyone who's on the right faction, and then it'll use them as the owner. If the previous owner, let's say, died, and then joined the wrong team, or just died instead as a spectator when their C4 went off. Technically, this would give hit markers to the random people, but it's better than accidentally triggering an explosion with the wrong faction, and I don't know how to use what we're about to use with just a specific team, so this is my workaround. Anyways, new line. What we're going to use is map.explode. Map.explode explodes a position on the map. And the only usage is with a position, projectile type, and attacker. It's not like I can specify faction. If I could, I would use that. That way, it'd be a bit more reliable. Anyways, we use item.position. We're going to use frag grenade. And we're going to use owner as we defined earlier. And now that this line is fully written, I can explain the ternary operator. If you stick parentheses around it in your head, what you basically want to do is just player owner is equal to, and then it's either this or this. And what defines this is this. So we could switch we could just do an if-else statement, which would be long, or we could combine it into one line. So this is like saying, if this, then owner is equal to this. Else, it's equal to this. I hope that makes sense. Now that we have this, what we want to do is unspawn the item, because it's a grenade, and we don't want to leave it there because it also explodes and stuff, and then we just break. This breaks the while true statement, which then stops the coroutine because there's no more code after that. Something I realized though, something better is probably item.destroy. Another thing that my IDE wants to do is to invert this if. I only invert ifs once I'm done writing stuff. Speaking of, yeah, you can make this static. So generally go with what your IDE says, unless you're in the middle of coding it. Like I said, I'm fine with nesting while I'm writing, because then it's easy for me to be like, okay, if this is false, I want to run something. Then all of a sudden, this being inverted would be bad. However, in this case, considering this is our final coroutine, I can just use my IDE, and my code looks slightly different. This ain't even formatted well. Well, I guess my IDE thinks it's the best, but I don't know. It's a bit hard to read, but that's with multiple lines, so you could combine it like this. Yeah, I'll just leave it at this. So, now we have our detect coroutine, which will trigger after our stick coroutine finds a spot to stick. Speaking of, stick can be made static. So now it sticks, now it detects. So if we were to throw an item with T, everything would work well. However, we're not fully done because, me personally, I don't want people to be able to steal other players' C4s, because that'd be pretty frustrating, but I also want to make it so the original owner can move the C4. And then I also don't want C4s to trigger into grenades because an explosion happened nearby. So because of that, there's other things to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do private void mouse dying. I'm going to call this on picking up item event args ev. And I'm going to subscribe to it up here. And like up here, I'm going to first check the item. Next thing I'm going to do is I want to know whether or not the person who's picking up the item is the previous owner. How I'm going to do this is if ev.pickup.previous owner is equal to null, return. And you might be wondering, how would the previous owner be null? It'll be, I'll show that later. This is just another check. Then in here, if ev.player is not equal to the previous owner, then we're going to set ev.isAllowed, which is something you can set to false, and all of a sudden this pickup thing never works. If you have any sort of hint interface, you can use it to display some sort of error message like, this is not your C4 or something. But because I'm not covering hint systems right now, I'm just going to simply disallow it. And if the player was the previous owner, this code never fires, meaning it was allowed, so the code runs. The issue is what if you want to give your C4 to somebody? That's where this line of code comes in. Now, we just make it if a player drops an item via right-click, then we set the previous owner to null, and then this return code will run, meaning this set thing will never happen. And then anyone else can pick up the C4 because it was never primed. How we do that is we add our false case up here. And what we do is ev.pickup.previous owner is equal to null, and that's it. So now you can't steal another person's C4. However, it's still susceptible to other grenades. So I'm going to fix this by creating another event. Now I got another event. Make sure to subscribe to it up here. Forgot the on, but yeah, just pick this, and it seems I misspelled it. Thankfully, your ID lets you make renaming things easily across everything, so I just right click it, rename it, changes the name up here. Pretty sweet. Now we have our event for if anywhere on the map, because it's a map event handler, it's not a player doing this, it's the map. If anywhere on the map a grenade a pickup changes into a grenade, this code will fire. Like many times prior, we check the pickup. If it is our custom item, we simply say false, because we don't want our custom item turning into a grenade, because that's not really how it works. This also works even if you drop your custom item normally. And something we did up here is the detect collisions. This should ignore the explosion of other grenades that happen nearby. This will disable it from turning into a grenade. So it'll essentially ignore any explosions. Now, everything's essentially done. Make sure you copy and switch your event subscriptions in your unsubscribe events function. That way you don't randomly subscribe to events and leave them there. And this should be our fully done custom item. We have it spawn, we have our description, await, we have our ID, make sure it's unique for any other custom items, name, we have all the functionality down here. I hope I explained it well enough. It's pretty simple. It probably could be improved, but I don't really care because I think it's going to work. Now, we build our plugin. By the way, these errors here just to do with the NuGet package, but if there's any error with building the plugin, it'll show up here. Now I just need to find my plugin, move it. It's become almost twice as large. Start server. Gonna start up SL, then I'm gonna join, and we're gonna see how it works. Alright, SL's booted up. Gonna join my server. Here's our previous functionality from last video. Ignore this. Must have forgotten to disable a plugin. No, yeah. It's a plugin I made previously. Anyways. Gotta remember not to give myself God mode. I'm gonna have to use the default Exiled custom item stuff. Here's our custom item. It's registered. If your item doesn't appear here, but there's no errors with your custom item, make sure you register it. I'm going to do CI spawn 1. Well, didn't spawn here. Oh, it's probably at 2, because ID 2? Nah. CI give. And it really does not want to work. There we go. I got my C4. There's a description. Even got the tiny text, and now I can test it. How do you test it? And well, it doesn't quite work now, does it? I expected this. Well, welcome to troubleshooting. I assume it has mostly to do with here, that the velocity is not necessarily set, per se. One solution would be to use timing.callDelayed. This simply delays something that happens. I'm going to put it on the one line so you can see it. Inside the brackets, you have whatever code you want. You can even multi-line it like this. But it's just one line of code. And here's the delay in seconds. Build it up again. Restart my server. Here's a C4. Now we check it, and ta-da, it works. Also looks like it's keeping its angular drag. So, if you want to keep this, you can. Would be funny. However, the fix is to simply go to where we set the rigid body. In here, yeah. It's likely this. Anyways, item.rigidbody.angular velocity is equal to 0. It'll work once we do that, don't worry. Anyways, you can see it works no matter how we throw it. Sticks everything perfectly. Make sure you check the directionality of it. And we can even try and stick it on the wall, which is a bit hard. But if you hit it in the right way, it'll be stuck up there. Next thing is you can throw it like a normal nade. Then you can throw it. Say, stick it up on the wall up there. And then I can make myself a D-boy. It should kill me with null because there's nobody on the tutorial team or the unclassified faction that it can pick. So it'll just default to null. It should be fine. Well, time for more debugging. Because I thought I fixed this. So it's clearly in here. There's no errors at least, so that's good. But I do not seem to be able to find... I can't seem to figure out what's going wrong. I guess... Give me a second while I check it. Oh. Time for me to debug. I'll be right back. Alright. So I finally figured out what was wrong after debugging, and I mean, it wasn't really my fault, but to give some context on how to debug, what you want to do is you want to add log.warn to wherever you're expecting code to run, and you should see some purple text in your server console if something were to happen. However, I know it's wrong, or I know it's wrong, so I can delete stuff now. If you want to check something inside a coroutine though, and an error is happening, but you don't see it in your log, in coroutines you need to add these try catch blocks, which literally just basically copy paste what I have. You just have your error generating code in here, then you just put this in here, and then if an error happens in a coroutine, it'll be printed to the console. So something to watch out for. You need this if you're ever going to see an error from a coroutine. Otherwise, it simply doesn't appear. What was wrong, though, is I had unsafe code off. To be specific, the error is that a method was inaccessible. Anyways, to fix it, you go up here, test plugin properties, debug, allow unsafe code. Okay, and then you rebuild it and it'll be fine now. Just gotta wait for my server to restart. Also, the angular velocity thing is here now, so it'll freeze. Now I should be able to change role, and it should explode and kill me. From dedicated server, because there was nobody on the tutorial team to use as the damage dealer. Now I can also throw it over there. I can even become a scientist, and it'll work fine. I can become another different kind of NTF, but as soon as I switch to something that's not NTF, I die. And that's exactly what we expected to happen. So this works exactly how we think it would work. And if you have any errors, good luck fixing it, because I mean some of this stuff is pretty frustrating. What we can check is to see if it naturally spawned in the map. Something else I didn't show. So 330 chamber. It's not in here, so it's probably in 096. Ta-da! C4. That's how spawn properties works, if you remember that in earlier. So now we have a C4. You can change it to a radio if you want, though you'd have to remove edit stuff, but that's up to you. What I've shown is pretty basic plugin. Well, basic custom item. You can always come back and rewatch the video however many times you want. It's not that complicated. I hope it taught you something, so that way you don't have to deal with people trying to figure out how to do basic coding inside beginner talk in the Discord, which you should join if you have coding questions. Regardless, that's all I have today. For what I cover next, I don't know. If somebody puts something I know in the comments, I'll cover it. I know a bit of audio, math, and that's about it. I also know Map Editor Reborn. I do not know custom roles that well, though. Just the basics. So, let me know what you want to see next. Bye.